What's the secret sauce of strategy consulting? I would argue that it is the obsessive focus on process in the way you work and approach problems. Now, an interesting thing I've noticed in doing work and helping train and working with former strategy consultants is that they often don't understand where their understanding of how to do the work comes from. They want me to come in with these extensive training decks showing in immense detail how to do different tactics and techniques. But while consulting firms do train you in these tactics and techniques, I really think it's the process and being thrown into the mix and doing things over and over again that leads to great work. Now, there are many structured processes for solving problems. McKinsey's is define, structure, prioritize, issue tree, analysis, synthesis, and recommendations. It comes from a famous memo that you have to read when you start the company, but there's other famous structured approaches to solving problems. For example, in Six Sigma, you have the DMAIC method: define, measure, analyze, improve, control. The scientific method, too, is a similar approach: question, hypotheses, experiment, analysis. And it's all pretty much doing the same thing. It's saying, here's this problem, how can we come up with questions, how can we analyze it, and then how can we come to conclusions? When I teach process and thinking about doing knowledge work with my clients in workshops, I put it in a very simple way. 1, define the problem. 2, come up with questions and hypotheses. 3, do research and analysis. And then 4, come up with answers. It's very similar to the SCQA framework, and I've linked below. I have a video on that as well if you want to check it out. But this doesn't really serve as a useful mental model of how things actually happen in consulting firms and broadly in knowledge work. The best way I've been able to think about it is as a time-based process that shifts people between 2 modes. These modes are top-down and bottom-up. Top-down thinking is thinking of things from a highest, most abstract level. This might be things like defining a problem, developing hypotheses, or even creating storyboards of a final presentation or the answers. Bottom-up is sense-making from the data and information first. And typically, people fall into one or the other bucket. You might want to pause and just think, are you a top-down person or a bottom-up person? It's usually pretty easy to notice. For example, if you're somebody that feels completely comfortable, like I do, diving into a huge data set, not knowing what you'll find, but excited about that, you're probably a bottom-up person. If you're somebody that likes to start with an outline, a structure of the problem, and know what the end product might look like before diving into it, you're probably a top-down person. In writing, I love how the fantasy writer Brandon Sanderson writes about this as discovery writing versus outline writing. He says discovery writers jump into the story if they're writing a novel and sort of figure out what the plot is along the way. Outline writing is when you start with an outline of what's going to happen and then fill in the holes, right? And the important thing he notes is that it's a spectrum. You're never going to be 100% on one side or the other. And in consulting, you have to develop both modes, bottom up and top down. When you're a junior level analyst, you're often spending a lot of time in the bottom up mode. For me, this was really enjoyable. But when I was shifted into the top down mode, it was different and challenging. It was a muscle I had to build over time. And so I want to dive in to this chart I've created to help really bring alive what it's like to shift between the top-down and bottom-up modes throughout a typical project or assignment that you're going to be working on. You can think of this process as something that could map to something you work on over a couple of hours, a week, or even over a few months. At first, you're at the top-down. You're defining the problem. This is where you're really trying to figure out what is the scope of what you're doing. What are the big questions, right? And in doing this, you may dig into detailed information or data to really inform that, but you're really trying to stay at high level and figure out what is the broadest, biggest problem that we're really solving here. From there, you're then, of course, going to dive into the data. And Sometimes you're not actually going to know what your hypotheses are about how to solve the problem or the direction you're going to take. You may need to figure it out. Now, doing this may actually reshape your own understanding of the problem. And this is why a lot of consulting firms often have what they call a diagnostic phase. This helps them get information from the client and the situation before having to scope the problem and actually sell a project. So sometimes they'll even do that diagnostic phase as a free upfront project. Now, once you've sort of like clarified that, you're at the high level again, right? And you're defining the hypotheses. Now you might refine the problem statement and then define the hypotheses, and you're asking high level questions. How can we generate more revenue? How can we cut costs? High level questions like that, right? And then you're going back down. You're into the mix. And this is where it's chaotic in a project. You're going to be shifting between modes. You're going to be diving into the data, but at the same time you're diving into the data, you're asking yourself questions. Where does this fit in? Does this answer the hypotheses? Does this change anything about the problem statement? Right? And back and forth between those two modes. You might be working with a team where somebody like a project manager might be shaping and driving the top-down questions and how it fits into the bigger picture while you're working on a very specific chunk, right? Or you might be responsible for both of those, and you have to figure out how to shift between those two different modes. One thing I recommend people do is sort of like formally shift between the two different modes, right? So if you're gonna just do a bunch of data analysis, block off a period after that where you're gonna summarize what you're looking at, right? And I actually like to do this in two different ways of working. For example, I might do the bottom-up mode on a computer, whereas the top-down mode, I might print stuff out and try to figure out what I'm actually looking at. And so this is the best way I've figured out how to think about the consulting process. In my work with clients, I often push them to think about how they actually work. I ask them, what is your process? Most of them look at me with a blank face. I don't know what my process is. And this is really about focusing on the meta process. What I say is like, you need to talk about how you solve problems. You need to be devoted to that. If you're a senior person at a consulting firm, you need to be thinking about how people work. And then how do we make this consulting process fit into our company? Create terms, approaches that are specific to how you're actually doing work. The more you focus on process, the more annoying and frustrating it can be too. Because what you're doing in process is you're saying, we actually don't know what the end product looks like. We're going to trust the process, hopefully better than the Philadelphia 76ers did. Sports shout out.
Anything you'd like to say?
Just the process.
And know that the process is what creates the great work. And after leaving consulting, this is probably the thing I miss the most, is that back and forth, that team environment where you're getting challenged, you're shifting between the two different modes, you don't know where you're going to end up. And then somehow, at the end of the project, you end up creating something and you look back and go, wow, that process worked.